International news now.
And we're going to start today with this extended discussion about Rex Tillerson that builds from this discussion of the poll results. And he has been under some pressure over the past couple of weeks after it was leaked that he called the President Trump, a blank moron, in response to a purported statement that Trump made regarding substantially increasing the American nuclear weapons arsenal by 10 times. It was a tenfold increase. And so he was looking at some slide presentations.
This was a briefing at the Defense Department with all the main generals and actors sitting around, and someone had put together a PowerPoint presentation that showed the quantity of nuclear weapons in America's arsenal over the last 70 years.
Right.
And there's
a height during the Cold War.
Yeah, it's in the early 60s. Right when the nuclear arms race was taking on another level after Eisenhower's New Look policy that expanded American reliance on nuclear weapons. Anyway, Trump saw the pitch and said—
Let's go back to that.
Yes, and said, I want that many nukes in our nuclear force.
Right. And what, of course, the Joint Chief of Staff and Rex Tillerson in particular said is that such an increase would have violated several treaties that the United States has signed to control and limit the number of nuclear weapons. And so we can't do that, right? And that's part of the, perhaps an experience of Donald Trump or what have you, but they then had to control this. And that's where he let loose this description, kind of not— he didn't say it to his face. I mean, it was afterwards, and somebody picked it up. And what's interesting about this is also it was leaked. I mean, he didn't say it to the press. He said it, someone heard it, and then they leaked it to the press, which is a big problem with this White House as well. So subsequently, President Trump has heard about this and got very angry, which is another part of this sort of dynamic. And there had to be an intervention. And the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, he clarified to the press that Trump did not actually call for this increase, and Trump clarified to the press that he wanted modernization of nuclear weapons, not an increase. But then also the relationship between Tillerson and Trump was damaged and had to be repaired. Trump made it public, right? And then they had this kind of silly thing about the IQ test that he said, well, we'll compare IQ tests and I'll win because he's so, smart. But Tillerson didn't deny making the comment when asked directly, but he did send out a spokesman that sort of deflected it or denied it. And in the immediate aftermath, there was a tense meeting, according to certain interviews and journalist accounts, between the two men that required the intervention of both Vice President Mike Pence and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis to kind of smooth things over. Now, what we want to talk about first is this exchange isn't the only piece of news that we can construct a narrative here. It comes in the context of some rather important apparent larger disagreements on several fronts between the Secretary of State and his president. And this is what makes Rex Tillerson's role here in trying to serve under President Trump so tricky and difficult. The two issues really stand out here. One is North Korea. Last week, Tillerson traveled to China to work on a diplomatic solution to the North Korean crisis. President Trump publicly undermined his efforts, saying that he was wasting his time trying to talk with the North Koreans. And so that caused a lot of speculation that Rex Tillerson is on his way out. We'll see some clips about how, they asked him directly how he should respond to that. And second is the nuclear deal. Both Tillerson and Mattis, along with H.R. McMaster, are said to have strongly lobbied Trump to stay in the deal, stay in the Iran nuclear deal, even if he decertified it, which he did. And so he could have just simply withdrawn from it. He could have unilaterally reimposed the sanctions, but he was talked out of that because that was his first impulse, by many accounts. And he was talked out of it by Tillerson and McMaster and Mattis. And so that's the broader context here. It's not just a comment that he shouldn't have said, perhaps under his breath in front of people, that got leaked to the press that caused a rift, but rather there's a series of disagreements that make a pretty tense relationship here. But first, there's even a broader context, and we want to take a step back and address a different element of this story in our first kind of stab at this, and Rex Tillerson and the State Department. And that is the more general de-emphasis of the role of the State Department and diplomacy under the Trump administration. And this begins with a major budgetary decision that's in the making here of substantially cutting the State Department's budget by upwards of 30%, which has received some serious pushback from not just Democrats, but also Republicans in Congress. And so we're going to start with this with a clip from an interview with Dexter Filkins, who wrote a feature story on Rex Tillerson for The New Yorker, and this comes from National Public Radio. So let's run that clip now.
Is Tillerson much of a carrot? Is he holding out many carrots?
Well, I think the carrot's getting smaller. I mean, and I think that's the concern. And the hammer, or the stick, is getting bigger. And so if you look at their respective budgets, the Office of Management and Budget, which has drawn up the proposed budget for 2018 for next year, which is what they're fighting about right now, they would cut the State Department's budget by 30%. And that's about, the State Department the budget's about right now about $55 billion a year. And they are proposing at the same time that they're cutting the State Department by 30%. They're proposing a $50 billion increase for the Pentagon. So their proposal on the table right now is to increase spending on defense as much as, or nearly as much as, the entire budget for the State Department. And so if you stand back and think about that, what does that mean for American foreign policy? You know, you've got the guns over here, and you've got the diplomats over here, and they're cutting the resources for the diplomats, and they're giving more resources to the guys with guns. And so I think that's what's disturbing to a lot of people right now, that the balance is changing.
But Tillerson seems to be one of the people leading the charge in dismantling the State Department. I mean, you write that there are like 48 ambassadorships that are vacant. 21 out of 23 assistant secretary positions are vacant or occupied by provisional employees because Congress hasn't confirmed appointees to the position. How much of this is intentional on Rex Tillerson's part?
Well, I think there's two answers to that question. The first is, to answer your question, he has his marching orders. That's to cut the budget and to cut the number of people, cut the number of diplomats working for the United States, and he's doing that. And he's trying to do it. And you know, Congress is actually pushing back. Remarkably, even the Republicans in Congress are saying, "Look, this is crazy. This is too much. These cuts are too deep. You know, we have to have a diplomatic presence abroad." And at the same time, I think that Tillerson is having a very, very difficult time filling jobs and filling, you know, typically at the State Department, you have the Secretary of State, and he's surrounded by assistant secretaries of state, and there's 25 of them or so. And what's happened in this case is because so many Republican, let's say, senior Republicans who with deep experience from foreign policy, so many of them during the campaign publicly spoke against the Trump candidacy or signed letters which were, you know, published in newspapers, et cetera, saying Donald Trump is not fit to be president. And so the whole Republican bench that you would call on to bring in to a new Republican administration, they're essentially blackballed. And if you go down those lists, that's a really long list. It's most of the real brain power in the Republican foreign policy establishment. So the result is Tillerson can't get anybody to work for him.
So the first thing to note, let's just summarize a little bit, is the magnitude of these cuts and the vacancies in the State Department. A 30% cut to the State Department's budget, it's beyond significant. It's arguably debilitating. At the same time, right, the article or the story mentioned that there's a proposal for an enormous spike in military spending, about a $50 billion increase, which is equal to the whole budget for the State Department. This sends a very powerful signal about the Trump administration's priorities and how it's going to interact with the rest of the world. a greater reliance on military power and less emphasis on diplomacy. And this seems to coincide with Trump's other decisions regarding international agreements that he has inherited from prior presidents. The United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, decertified the Iran nuclear deal, and is renegotiating or may withdraw from NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Accord with Canada and Mexico. And Trump has at times questioned his/America's commitment to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the United Nations. What's more, the Trump administration has been slow in putting in place personnel within the State Department. As the clip noted, 48 ambassadorships and assistant secretary positions remain vacant. This compounds the projected budget cut. There's simply no one to mind the store and provide leadership within the vast State Department bureaucracy. And remember again, what's the State Department doing? What are diplomatic officials doing? They are the official representatives of American interests around the world. And so if you don't have staff people in these countries protecting, helping out citizens, U.S. citizens when they're abroad, talking to government officials, acquiring information, this presents a challenge for the representation of American interests and protecting the interests of its citizens around the world. So what are the reasons behind these motives? Is the Trump administration consciously gutting the State Department by starving it of resources and personnel? Or is this a competency issue and an inadvertent result of an administration that is failing to staff its own bureaucracy? Now, the perspective from the clip is that both of these are at work. Tillerson is executing Trump's call to significantly shrink the State Department. Now, this is a philosophy in which diplomacy is less valued, and thus its share of scarce resources are substantially reduced. We see isolationism here. Tillerson is following marching orders from his president to reduce the footprint of the State Department. Now, there's also commentary that Tillerson himself comes from a different background as a former CEO of Exxon, in which efficiency is valued over other competing values, including arguably effectiveness, if it comes at too great a cost. So perhaps he's comfortable with the reduction of his own department's resources.
Or he did a whole study, right? He took a top to bottom look at the State Department, and there was got a lot of criticism for that because he's looking for efficiency gains, right?
But the Trump administration also faces this personnel shortage because there is deep resistance to its policies, and Trump himself, from within the Republican establishment, that said while he was running as a cabinet that they wouldn't work in a Trump White House, and now they are effectively blackballed. Right? This is the foreign policy bench that could work in the administration, but the administration refuses to appoint them. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about what we lose when we shrink the State Department by that much. And we're going to do that by listening to more of this NPR clip from in the interview with Dexter Filkins.
And basically, if you go back to, I quoted President Truman's Secretary of State in my piece, Dean Acheson. If you go back that far to the late 40s and early 50s, you know, Acheson says we inherited a world that was in chaos and in ruins, and we wanted to, at any cost, we wanted to avert another world war. And how can we do this? And so they came up with, everything, all these institutions that we know today, the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, and not, this stuff was very ad hoc and kind of, this institution got formed in 1948 and the next one in 1950, and they kind of evolved over time. But that today we've inherited this kind of vast architecture of arrangements and relationships and treaties, and so that everything from bandwidth, computer bandwidth, to the number of bluefin tuna that you can take out of the water every year, just the number of things which are negotiated and written down and codified in treaties, and which are managed every day by our diplomats because there's disputes going on all the time, and these arrangements have to be changed and altered. This is the world that we live in, and this is the world that we have, and for all its problems. But it's and I think the the thing that is troubling is, and the thing which is worrying, and which I think everybody needs to kind of think about is, are we dismantling this? Is that what Secretary Tillerson and President Trump are doing when they say we want to cut the budget of the State Department by 30%? If I asked Secretary Tillerson and he said no, that's not what we want to do. But when you see what's happening to our diplomatic corps, and you see what the budget cuts are potentially doing, and the people who are leaving, the amount of expertise which is leaving, it's scary. It's scary.
So the clip here highlights some of the consequences that observers worry about when diplomacy is relegated to a secondary priority by making the spending choices that the Trump administration is moving towards. So the critics suggest, American leadership is threatened. The U.S. has spent many decades since the end of World War II building up its expertise around the world and creating an institutional and legal infrastructure to support the American-led order. Now, this expertise has been housed in the State Department, and it's a very different type of expertise than the military has, which stands to get a large infusion of resources in this shift from investing in diplomacy to investing in military power. Diplomats in the State Department project American soft power with knowledge of the history, politics, culture, and languages of many different regions around the world. And as the clip suggests, it's the State Department that is experts on democracy promotion, economic development, public health, and all sorts of other issues that, as the one superpower in the world, the U.S. has addressed as the one country uniquely positioned to be the key actor on these issues and support the construction of international agreements. Now, once dismantled by underfunding or simply not hiring people to fill key positions in this vast bureaucracy around the world, the worry is it's going to be difficult to rebuild. We've taken for granted that the United States will be the indispensable nation, in President Barack Obama's words, that has the competence to manage a world that is still shaped today by this great power settlement that was constructed after World War II. And then, remember, the U.S. doubles down on this larger international order in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and at the end of the Cold War in 1990 and 1991 by promoting democracy abroad, by strengthening NATO, and by strengthening what at that time was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and creating the World Trade Organization. So these conversations ask, right, if the U.S. is retreating from its traditional leadership role, then who or what takes its place and what are the consequences for international politics and for America's capacity to defend its interests in the international order. Now, in the interview, Filkin mentions Russia or China. China in particular has been presenting itself as an alternative to the United States on issues like climate change. If so, that would be a very different world with a different set of values and institutions than the ones that the U.S. has emphasized in the last 70 years, which has instead focused on democracy, human rights, and economic globalization.
Okay, so that's the first context, is that Rex Tillerson is situated in a context that has already undermined his role within the administration, a lesser role for the State Department, a greater role for the military, and he has participated sort of fully in that by not filling vacancies and by going along with these deep budget cuts. And so now we're going to shift to these battles that he's faced where he personally kind of gets challenged in his decisions by President Trump, and he also pushes back on Trump himself to try to shape the decisions that are being made. And so we're going to run a clip that kind of revisits the North Korea issue briefly with the same interview by Dexter Filkins about how President Trump undermined Rex Tillerson in his trip to China.
What are you hearing about the relationship between Tillerson and Trump?
Well, it's funny. Initially, when I started talking to people, and the people around him say, it's great, they talk all the time. They talk several times a day. Trump calls him, middle of the night, whenever he wants. And I think that's true. But, there's an anecdote which many of your listeners will have heard by now, which is Tillerson was apparently in a meeting after he was complaining about one of Trump's speeches. and he called him a moron, and there was another word attached to the word moron, which I won't repeat. But I think, I think he's frustrated. I think it's difficult for, Rex Tillerson is, I think, he's a pretty sober and a pretty steady guy, and of course the president is anything but that. And I think Tillerson in particular has been trying very hard in places like North Korea, where we have a terrible crisis on our hands, to make a diplomatic solution to try to avert war. I think the possibility of war with North Korea right now is very real. And so, he flies out to China to try to make a deal and to try to make a diplomatic deal to stave off war. And the president makes fun of him, and he undercuts him. Rex, you're wasting your time. He's the Secretary of State of the United States. I think he's pretty frustrated with that. He feels like he can't do his job.
One official told you the only reason why Tillerson has stayed this long is loyalty to the country.
Yeah. He's an Eagle Scout, and there's a lot of Eagle Scouts in the president's cabinet, and there's a lot of generals around him. And somebody said to me, the only people left around the president are generals and Boy Scouts, and they're hanging in there not because they like it, or not because they're, pleased to go into work every day, but because they feel a responsibility to the country.
So this goes back to our second poll here, and it directly addresses this. What do these people who feel an obligation to the country to help, this Trump administration, they're conservatives, they're Republicans, they have been asked to serve, and instead of declining or having kind of taken themselves out of the running prior to the resolution of the election by signing, letters saying that Donald Trump was unfit for office, they're what's left. And a lot of them, and it's probably not an accident that a lot of them are military, and because they serve under duress, right? No one wants to go to war, and in this context, there's some challenges to serving in this presidential administration, and so these people, I think this is what kind of gives some of the impetus for higher public opinion polls for these advisors is that they have some respect, that they're trying to shape this administration's decisions to manage Donald Trump. And here is where you've got another aspect of Rex Tillerson already playing a weak hand, right? They're undermining the State Department in general. But then when he takes action, he travels to China trying to open up direct channels with the North Koreans to start a diplomatic process, because from his perspective, there is no real viable or preferable military option because of the thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of casualties that would come with any sort of military interchange with North Korea. That, of course, you have to try to work out a diplomatic solution. And here's where he's facing another series of frustrations and constraints, because then Donald Trump, unlike his advisors, who are always playing to an audience of one and deferring to the president as they need to and should, the president doesn't protect his advisors, and he instead has come out publicly during that time and said that Tillerson was wasting his time. He shouldn't be engaging in these practices. You would think that there would have been a discussion between the president and the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, before he went off on this trip, to make sure that they're both on the same page. But I think that what you find in this is that lots of things change and change very quickly. And then you get tweets and news conferences that change the dynamic here. And so Rex Tillerson then was faced with the additional problem of being publicly sort of humiliated, if you will, and undermined by his president, and then having to address the press in and questions from the press about, okay, well, what does this mean? Are you on your way out? Why are you still here? There was a lot of commentary that he was going to quit or get fired. And so we're going to run another clip, a short one here, of his response with an interview with Jake Tapper in CNN that confronts that directly. And so let's take a look at that.
I want to ask about Senator Bob Corker, who said something about you, and he was referring, he's a friend of yours, he has tremendous respect for you, he speaks highly of you all the time. He says that you're one of the best things about the cabinet, and he's dismayed, he thinks President Trump is constantly undermining you. This is a Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He said that the president has, quote, castrated you before the world stage. That's his word, not mine. What's your response to that?
Well, as I indicated earlier, Jake, I think this is an unconventional president. He uses unconventional communication tools. He uses unconventional techniques to motivate change. Again, I would say I am fully committed to his objectives. I agree with his objectives. I agree with what he's trying to do. How he wants to use his own skills tactically to push things toward change, I'm there to help him achieve those.
That's all. You have a cattle ranch. You don't want to say anything about the senator suggesting you've been gelded before the world. That's not anything that bothers you.
I checked. I'm fully intact.
I did not expect that answer.
Okay, we're going to let that be the last word here. There was something on the slide you'll notice about Nikki Haley in the conflict. Another aspect of this, a conflict between Rex Tillerson and Nikki Haley, in which those two reportedly don't agree and like each other. And this is just another aspect of the conflict within the administration, because Nikki Haley is seen as a potential successor to Rex Tillerson, and there's some resentment there as well. And so you can see this in the battle over the Iran nuclear deal that we've already noted. But let's move on to
Well, let me just say that all of this discussion today, these are examples of the challenges associated with managing a huge foreign policy bureaucracy that we talked about when we looked at the executive branch and the president's role in making foreign policy. What we're seeing are manifestations of turf battles, interdepartmental conflict, and disagreement. And not only that, when it's much more challenging to implement the agenda of the president when the president actively undermines you while you're trying to implement that agenda, which is really what happens in the North Korean situation.